We here at the Sports History Network proudly partner with 26 podcasts, all revolving around the history of sports. But did you know that many of our hosts were sports history authors way before they started their shows? It's true. We've got Joe Ziemba, host of When Football Was Football, Joe Zagurski, host of Pro Football in the 1970s, Mark Morthier, host of Yesterday's Sports, Tommy Phillips, host of Lombardi Memories, and Scott Adamson, co-host of From the 55-Yard Line. All these authors have many books for you to choose from. To check them out, go to our website at sportshistorynetwork.com/sportshistorybooks. Pick up your copy today. Soundtrack provided by Kevin MacLeod of filmmusic.io.
We're coming to you with this episode with a special guest, Kevin Bryant. He's going to be talking about some of the more devious things that have happened in the National Football League with espionage and spying of team versus team. Kevin's got his story and what's in his book coming up in just a moment.
This is the Pigskin Daily History Dispatch, a podcast that covers the anniversaries of American football events throughout history on a day-to-day basis. Your host, Darren Hayes, is podcasting from America's North Shore to bring you the memories of the gridiron, one day at a time. So as we come out of the tunnel of the Sports History Network, let's take the field and go no huddle through the portal of positive gridiron history with pigskindispatch.com.
This podcast is part of the Sports History Network, your headquarters for the yesteryear of your favorite sport. You can learn more at sportshistorynetwork.com.
Hello, my football friends. This is Darren Hayes of pigskindispatch.com. Welcome once again to the Pigpen, your portal to positive football history. And we're going to look into that portal today of great gridiron history. And we have a guest that has written a book. His name is Kevin Bryant, and he's wrote a book called Spies on the Sidelines, The High-Stakes World of NFL Espionage. Sounds very interesting. We'll bring Kevin in right now. Kevin Bryant, welcome to the Pigpen.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Well, we really appreciate you taking the time out of your day to come in and talk to us about this book. It sounds very exciting. But before we get into the gist of the book, we'd like to learn a little bit more about you. How did you become interested in the game of football?
Well, geez, I was living in Seattle at the time. My dad was a Seahawks fan, and I just remember, I was just a punk little kid. It was a Seahawks-Broncos game. And I just decided to root for the team that was playing against the Seahawks. And, it was led by John, Broncos were led by John Elway at the time and all of that. And I saw that game, and that was really the first football game I really remember watching. I was probably in the, fourth grade or something around there. And I just remember seeing John Elway just work his magic and pull out an amazing win. And I was like, whoa, that was pretty cool. And ever since then, I've been a Broncos fan, and I've been hooked on football since.
Well, John Elway certainly had a lot of comebacks and brought people to their feet in Denver for 15, 20 years. I think he was there from a good part of the 80s and all the 90s. So great guy to be a fan of. Actually, I'm a Steelers fan here. I'm in Western Pennsylvania, and I can tell you that Ben Roethlisberger, he chose number 7 in honor of John Elway because he liked the style of playing, and much of his younger career, he tried to emulate John Elway. So
yeah, he was a heck of a quarterback with a heck of a career. Same could be said for Roethlisberger as well.
Yeah. I think actually, if I remember correctly, John Elway's first NFL game, or one of his first games, was against the Steelers. And because I can remember him coming in, it must have been like the first or second week of that year of his rookie year. He was a good quarterback then too.
Yeah, he had a brutal first year, but he, I think back then coaches were much more prone to stick with their quarterbacks through the bad times and let them develop a little, and something you don't see as much of today. I often wonder, you take a guy like Elway who really struggled that first year. If he's in there playing today, does he get yanked towards the end of the season? And they're like, yeah, we're done with this guy. We're moving on to the next guy. I think that's a very real possibility.
It definitely could, but you look at some of those quarterbacks that took their lumps and came out all right. You have Peyton Manning didn't have a very good rookie year. well, I know Terry Bradshaw didn't. He was 1-13, I think, his rookie year. So there's a lot of quarterbacks, but you're right. That's old school coaching. They knew they had a high draft pick, and they were going to live or die with them. And luckily, with those cases, 3 cases we just talked about with Elway and Manning and Bradshaw, for their teams, they did succeed and became pretty good quarterbacks. That's for sure. Besides John Elway playing, but what's the moment that made you want to write a book about the NFL?
Well, I've been wanting to write a book for quite a while. I just couldn't find that one topic that I could really settle on. I'd start writing a book and then be like, nah, this just isn't right. And I probably did that 4 or 5 times. And I was in Germany at the time. I was working on a master's degree in intelligence studies, followed by one in sports management. And everything with Spygate had already happened. Spygate 2, where, when Josh McDaniels was in Denver, they had the team recorded a practice of another team. And at that point, I really started to wonder. I was like, wow, I wonder how much spying actually goes on in professional football. So I hopped on the internet and started researching the subject. I probably did that for about a month, just, after work, checking out all these articles for an hour or two. And at the end of a month, I'd really found what there was to find. And I hopped on Amazon, looked for books. There was one by Brian O'Leary about Spygate, and that was it. And I was like, wow, there's nothing that talks about spying across the NFL, across the whole history, with all of the teams. And I was like, wow, this could be my chance to write that book that I've wanted to. And it's a subject that, I have a bachelor's degree in history, with the master's degrees, it all paired up well. I was a former special agent, so I had some experience protecting and collecting information.
Well, thank you for your service, sir.
Absolutely. Thank you. And I just thought it all paired up well. And I thought, you know what? If this isn't my book, I'm never going to find it. So,
well, okay. So let me get this straight. You really are checking some boxes here. You're a history major. This is about history. You had a major in intelligence studies and a major in sports management. I mean, you hit everything. This is like the perfect topic of a book for you. You're the perfect person to write this. So I think we got the right person here to chat about this.
Well, I hope so. Yes.
Oh, very interesting. Okay. So was the Spygates of the Patriots and the Josh McDaniels, are those sort of the center of your book? Is that what is centered around, or is there like a bunch of different stories in this?
So no, and I think that's the unique aspect of the book. And that's a question I get a lot. Is this all about the Patriots? And the answer to that is no. This is a book that is all about the collection techniques that all or nearly all NFL teams use to gather information on their opponents to try to get a game day advantage. So it covers the entire history of the NFL, and it's got stories from every single NFL team in there. And in addition to how teams collect, it also goes through all the countermeasures. So what do teams do to protect and defend against other teams trying to gather that information on them? The book does have a section on the Patriots. I've got a chapter on Spygate, Deflategate, and another chapter on everything else about the Patriots that, quite frankly, not a lot of people know about. But the emphasis is not just the Patriots.
You're not having a sort of a vigilance against the Patriots per se. You're talking about everybody in the NFL and how people of all the teams are crossing the line to gain an advantage, because that's really what the game of football is. You're trying to gain an advantage. It's those that stay within the boundaries of the rules and those that don't. And I think you're looking at some of those people that sort of crossed over the line a little bit.
Sure. So the way the book is broken down is the first section of the book covers all of the illicit, which means everything that's not permitted by the NFL, all the techniques that they're using that aren't permitted or that are questionable, such as, they may be technically allowed by the rules, but a lot of coaches would say they're unethical practices. So that's going into stuff like spying on practices,
Okay.
lip reading, headset tampering. And then it moves on to all of the permissible techniques that teams use. So there we've got stuff like, advanced scouting, debriefing players coming from other teams. And then I go through the third section is all about the draft, how teams assess draft prospects and free agents. And then also how teams collect information on how their opponents assess prospects, right? Because during the draft, you always want to get the most bang for your buck. And you don't want to draft someone in the first round that you could draft in the second round. So to be able to do that and manage the draft, the teams are always gathering information on their opponents, which I think is a really interesting, topic to discuss. And then the fourth portion of the book is all about the Patriots.
Okay. But definitely that draft, that's really interesting you bring that up, because there's quite a bit of gamemanship that's being played in that, especially these past few years. You know that some of these teams are leaking out. Yeah, we're interested in this guy when they maybe really aren't, sort of maybe throwing a smoke screen of who they really want. And some of them are just maybe trying to undo that psychology and saying, we're leaking out that we do want to have this guy. And so you never really know what's the truth and what's not. And neither do the other teams that are drafting ahead and behind those teams. So that's interesting. Do you have any examples maybe from the draft that you could share with us from the book, or is that something you'd rather keep for the readers?
Well, let's see. For example, I can go through, I know, we talked about the Broncos, being a Broncos fan. I know when the Broncos selected Jerry Jeudy, there was a lot of talk about what, before that, what wide receiver the Broncos were going to pick. The biggest one at the time was Henry Ruggs. He was a speed guy that everyone said Denver really needs this guy. And he was the consensus number 1 overall draft pick. And, Denver came out and said before the draft, we may see the draft board for wide receivers a little different than everybody else. And nobody knew how to take that. Is that a smokescreen? Is that reality? And given how Henry Ruggs' career panned out, maybe it was the truth. But, it's really hard to tell. And these teams they're really sneaky about it, how they go about it. And there's some pretty funny examples out there of how far teams are willing to go to hide who they want or to get the pick that they want. There's tales in my book of how teams have hid tape of a player from other teams. They'd request it from the college and then never return it, because they're like, yeah, okay, we like this guy and we don't want other teams to know that this guy's good. So
I think I probably know that example. It's probably about my team, I'm sure.
It is about the Steelers. Yes.
I think I've heard this one before, but that's a good one though. And I think so. We might as well bring it out. You're talking about, of course, Bill Nunn, the great scout of the Steelers who just made the Hall of Fame last summer, with John Stallworth, I'll bet you.
Yep, precisely. So, that was a classic example. I think, this, the Steelers, I think that was under Chuck Noll at the time, if I remember right.
Yes.
Yeah, they were real high on him. They saw his tape. He had got downgraded because he had ran a slow, 40 or 100-yard dash, whatever he was timed at. But the Pittsburgh scout noticed that the grass at the field, at the college field where he was tested, was really thick and long. And he said, you know what? This guy's not slow. I think it's just the field. And so, they had a pretty high draft. They placed a second or third round value on him. I believe it was actually, I remember them saying specifically, actually, he was the top Steelers target that draft. But they managed to get him way down in the draft. Just because of, hiding that tape and doing their due diligence. And, I think that's just one example of, teams willing to go pretty far. It's amazing what goes on out there. There are teams that'll have dropped fake hints of what players they're after, and then spreading it around the NFL as rumors, with no interest whatsoever in drafting the player. So all of that goes on.
How about some of the, you alluded to a little bit, the first part of your book is maybe some of the in-game type espionage. Maybe you have a couple examples of that you could share with us.
Yeah. So there's a lot of different stuff that goes on. So you've got everything from stealing signals. I know that's a big one. Everyone's always talking about that, right? So to give you an example of how much that can impact a game, the Super Bowl between Denver and Seattle, I think that was Peyton Manning's third to last year. So this before the game, the Seahawks actually managed to decipher all of Peyton Manning's hand signals that he would use for audible calls. So the Seahawks basically taught their defenders, at least one defender who, told everybody else what was happening, or the whole team, I don't know. But the bottom line is that every time Peyton Manning went to audible that game, that the Seahawks knew exactly what was going to happen. And that the Broncos has finished that Super Bowl 7 points. And they were the highest scoring offense in the history of the NFL going into that game for that season. And they were held to 7. And that's a big reason why. Because when Peyton Manning would audible, and we all know he's the master at reading what the defense is giving and adjusting the play accordingly, every time he would do that, the Steelers would know, okay, I now know the route that my receiver is running, and they would react accordingly. And that often meant jumping in front of routes or being all over that receiver when the ball got to him. And for a quarterback who is he is a timing quarterback, he's releasing that ball before his wide receiver ever even makes that cut, because he knows where he's going to be, because he doesn't have that rocket of an arm like a John Elway. He can't get it in there. It's got to be timing. And against a team like Seattle that knew exactly what was going to happen, it was devastating. It was devastating. It was the game.
Kevin, I've got an ethical question for you, and I'm not sure there's a right answer. Okay, but that example you just gave right there of stealing Peyton Manning's signals or knowing his signals, is there any difference between that and getting a take on somebody? I know defenders, do that all the time. They'll look at, maybe there's a running back that, leans a little bit harder on his down hand when he's going to get the ball or something like that, where you're gaining an advantage for defense. Is there any difference between getting a read off of a player from taking a signal, or studying body language and knowing that?
So it depends. So I think the question really comes down to is the information used? Look, all teams are going to use the information that they have, right? No one can blame him. That's part of the game. I think the question becomes, how do you get the information? So do you get it off a game tape, off a film study? If that's the case, perfectly legitimate. Is it obtained through managing to steal a playbook of another team? Because, I've got a whole chapter in my book about stealing paperwork, out of the locker room, out of hotels, sneaking to other teams' locker rooms. All of that stuff happens. Are you talking about getting it from an insider inside of an organization? A spy, essentially, on the other team. All this stuff has happened. So, there are many ways to get the information. I think that's what makes it really interesting. And for teams, like the Broncos with Elway, and you're ultimately left there scratching your head going, how did they figure this out? You can see what happened watching the film after the game. You know what happened. It's just a matter of going, how the heck did they do it? And sometimes you never get that question answered. And and then you have to change everything. Do you have to change your signals, change your playbook, figure out, okay, do we have a spy inside of our organization? And that may sound completely paranoid, but these are things that teams are absolutely 100% worried about. When Scott Pioli was the general manager over with the Chiefs, he used to ensure that his security members would come by and close all of the blinds of the offices that overlooked the practice field for the Chiefs, because he was worried that an insider within that organization would be spying and potentially telling another team what's going on during practices before a game. So these are things that teams absolutely 100% are worried about, day in and day out, and some more than others. And some aren't worried at all, and some should be, and some are too paranoid. It's a fine line.
Yeah. I know I've read some things, and I know the Steelers are guilty of this too, where you'll be playing an opponent, especially a divisional opponent. Let's just take Steelers and Ravens. Usually they have their games a little bit later in the season. They play both their games in the latter half, and maybe one or the other will pick up somebody that just gets recently cut. Maybe it's a practice squad quarterback that's been in all the quarterback meetings, knows what the offensive basic schemes are. That guy will get cut, be a free agent. The other team will pick him up on their practice squad, practice them for a little bit, get through both those games, and then cut them. I mean, you hear and read about that all the time in season. And I don't know if that's what some of the espionage type of things that you're talking about in the book as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So my book, it's called Spies on the Sidelines, the High Stakes World of NFL Espionage. And I've got a whole chapter on just that subject. It's debriefing players and coaches that leave from one team and go to another. And at times that can simply be, hey, you used to play for the Steelers last year, and now you're with the Saints. So when the Saints play the Steelers, they're going to talk to that player and try to figure out, hey, what do you know? What do you know about what signals they're using? What are the strengths and weaknesses of the quarterback? Whatever their point of emphasis that the coaches want to learn about on that new team. But that can also be, teams specifically bring in players a lot of times off of another team's practice squad, just for the point of debriefing them for a single game. I mean, and then they're gone. They'll come in, they'll be like, oh, great, you're available, blah, blah, blah. You bring them in, you debrief them for what they know about the other team. And, and those practice squad players, frankly, they're just happy to have that NFL paycheck for a week. And it's a foot in the door, and they're going, okay, well, if I do my job, maybe next time that they need somebody, they'll think of me. And yeah, it's that absolutely happens all the time. Even when players are cut from a team, sometimes coaches will call them up, especially if they know they're disgruntled. Hey, I know you just got cut. You want to tell us all about, about the other team. And sometimes players bite, or even coaches. There's story in my book of a coach calling another coach that, one coach just got fired, and he's like, I'm not happy about this. I'm gonna call this other team this opponent that that the team that just fired me is about to play, and I'm gonna give them a whole bunch of good information.
What did you find to be the most surprising acts of espionage? Because I know you have them in groups. What was the most surprising to you as you were doing your research for the book?
I would say the most surprising is having some former coaches and former players of teams provide information to opponents based upon, a lot of times it was either wanting to further their own career, especially coaches that were moving on, or players that just needed the money. So, I'm sure but I don't think, there's a lot of fans who probably don't know this, but a lot of NFL players, that money comes and goes really quickly, either because it's a short career and they haven't earned a lot. While we all think they make a fortune, the reality is, if, the average player is in the league 3 or 4 years and then they're gone, if they're making a league minimum, and especially if they're spending, on the heavy side, that money's gone within a few years after they retire. And there's so many cases of NFL players going bankrupt. So, there are stories of players that are still welcome to attend practices with that organization, right? Because they're part of the history of that organization. They're like, oh yeah, you come on back. But in reality, they're supplying information to another opponent for a paycheck. That's happened. And I know it's kind of gut wrenching for fans of their team to think about, especially, players that help, put wins on the board. But that is a concern, that especially those paranoid teams are taking into account, on a week in, week out basis of, man, you can't even trust your own sometimes.
Yeah, I think that's something that we, as outsiders and fans of I guess all sports, not just the NFL, we take for granted that, as fans, we have an allegiance to our team. You're a Denver Broncos fan. I'm a Pittsburgh Steelers fan. There's Dallas Cowboys fans. You're not going to leave that allegiance and root for another team because that's your team. Well, these players, they're doing it because that's their livelihood. They're getting paid. And like you said, some of these guys that are no longer getting a paycheck, they're welcome to come to practice as well. They have an opportunity to make money for their family and, sustain themselves a little bit with a couple extra, bucks in their pocket. That's an incentive for them. They don't have the allegiance that I think we as fans do. We're sort of more aligned to the ownership, where the coaches and players are more mercenary, I guess.
Yeah. Tim Green, who was a former Falcons player, he talked about that in a book that he wrote. And he said, quite frankly, he's like, yeah, players are mercenary. And that's the way the NFL is nowadays. Back in the day when you could make an entire career on one team, and that was, I won't necessarily the norm, but it was, it wasn't all that far-fetched. Nowadays, that's a rarity. I mean, unless you're an elite quarterback or elite defensive end, maybe you spend your whole career with one team, but it's just not likely. That's not part of the game. And these players are looking to maximize their profits and find the best fit for them. And that means switching teams quite a bit, if you have a long career, usually. So yeah, they're mercenary.
Yeah, I don't know if I've always had problems with that, especially players that are like a fixture of their team, like Emmitt Smith, all the years with Dallas Cowboys, and you see him in a Cardinals uniform the last 2 years of his career. Or, in my case, Franco Harris, one of the greatest Steelers running backs of all time, playing for Seattle in a final year. You have that happen quite a bit. And, Dorsett, I think, end up changing teams. And it's hard to realize that as, again, we're fans and we're thinking with the fan mentality and saying, allegiance to your team. Once you're a Viking, you're always a Viking or whatever the team name is. And then when you see them go to another team, it's hard to watch that as fans, even if it's not your team. I don't know if you have that same problem or not, but I have trouble making that register in my brain.
Yeah, it breaks your heart. It does. I don't like that part of the game. And frankly, I understand why the NFL did it, obviously with the salary cap and trying to create parity with all the teams. And obviously, you don't want to be a fan of a team that struggles for 30 years. So obviously, the NFL built in the salary cap to create parity around the league. And that's great for those teams that have historically struggled quite a bit and are now able to find a little more success based upon this. And however, I think what it's done is exactly the problem that you described. Now you have these fans that are very loyal to the especially the key players of their team, but those same players are not loyal, and they really can't be, based on how things are structured, and teams can't afford to keep them, especially when you build a Super Bowl team. If you build a Super Bowl team, a ton of those players that got you there, they're going to be gone the next year. That's the reality. You can't afford to pay them. But that's, it's painful as a fan to see that. And I'd really love to see the NFL kind of find a happy compromise of, okay, how do we allow those teams to stay intact? How do we allow players to spend their whole career on one team if they want to do it, and still have that idea of trying to build parity around the league? I don't have the answer, but I know everybody would love to see that.
Yeah, well, I think everybody, but if I take the side of the NFLPA or the players themselves, that's really how they were able to start making money. When you think about the great players of the 70s, they made nowhere near what the players started making in the 80s and 90s. And, now it's off the charts. So I think having that competition between teams, they are a product. They're selling themselves as a product to the NFL, to the different teams. Highest bidder gets them, and best contract situation for them. So I think the NFLPA and the players are going to be the ones that are going to be standing up against more about that than even the NFL themselves were, because the NFL would love to just keep teams locked in like it was for years and years and decades before that.
Yeah. No, I think you're spot on. Absolutely.
Okay, let's talk a little bit about the book itself. There's going to be some listeners out there that are going to be real excited to get their hands on this book, and we'll give them some information where they can get that in just a moment. What would a potential reader expect to get out of this book when they open it up and sit down to start reading this?
Well, I think the first thing you're going to get is a better comprehension of what really goes on behind the scenes of a football game. I think a lot of it, me as a fan, before I started researching this book, I thought, well, you do your film study, you go to practices, you implement a little strategy, and you wash, rinse, repeat. And wow, after doing the research, there's so much stuff. And both offensively and defensively that go into it. And it's a lot. And I think the interesting thing is, you can go overboard to either side. If you don't prepare for teams collecting on you, you're going to get blindsided, man. You're going to get destroyed. And if you get too paranoid, you don't have time to do a proper game plan and to implement all of that. And you're too worried about stuff that is tangential, and you're not focused enough on the core football strategy of what needs to be done. And obviously, you got to be concerned about that more with some teams than others. But I can tell you, there's so many examples in this book over and over again of critical games being determined by collecting on your opponents and being prepared and being better prepared than them. And game after game, Super Bowl after Super Bowl, big, huge plays just coming down to that. And it is absolutely critical. In the military, we call it a full force multiplier. This may not be the thing that in and of itself wins games, but it's what's going to give you that edge. And in a fair fight, you're always looking for whatever edge you can, because it's a struggle of life and death, which, we always say that about football. And, it's obviously a bit of an exaggeration, but, you look at the parity around the league right now and the 2000 and just last year's playoffs, the 2021 playoffs. Look how close all of those games were. Towards the end, everything was coming down to who's the last team to have the ball. And it was just amazing. But that just shows you, like any advantage you can find, it's critical. And I think that's what you're going to find in this book is just, the theme of the book is whatever it takes. And that was an expression that Chuck Noll used and along with Al Davis. And both those coaches worked together with Sid Gilman back in San Diego. So somehow the one guy probably got it off another, or they both got it off of Sid Gilman. Who knows? But over and over in the book, it's all about how far are teams willing to go, players, coaches, what are they willing to do to get those wins, to stay in the league? And that's one of the big topics I talk about. It's not just about winning, but this is a dream for all of those guys, right? These are guys who grew up from the age of 5 and 6 playing football and just wanted to be around the sport. And they've made it, and they've got all their money. They've got their job. They've got their friends. This is their hobby. This is their profession. Man, everything in their life is football. And so they're clinging to this dream as long and as hard as they can. And you know what? If they've got to spy a little bit to get the job done, whether it be with permissible means or illicit, absolutely. There are guys that are going to do that because this is everything to them. This is their life.
Okay. Now, I just had a thought come to me, and maybe you could clarify this for me or confirm it. Now, would you say, okay, we know that we're living in an age where, technology has never been better, and it's going to keep improving. It's on a course. It's always a dynamic thing. It's getting better and better. So, with cell phones and, all of us have a camera in our pocket type of thing. Is there more clever means to do some of this NFL espionage today, or was it better back? Were people more clever back in the let's say the 60s and 50s when there wasn't the technology available, but they sort of had to use their brain and some things like that. I'm just trying to get a gauge for this.
No, that's actually a great question. So I think that's the interesting part of the book, and the fact that it covers the whole history of the NFL, because the collection techniques that teams have used have changed. And some things that were very effective in the past are not as effective now, such as spying on practices. Teams used to hold practices out on fields, high school fields, junior college fields, parks, anywhere they could, right? And you could park your car on the side of the road and watch one of these practices, especially if you're willing to use a set of binoculars. Very effective back in the day. Now that lots of teams are holding practices inside of practice facilities, inside of domes, how are you going to spy on, you got to sneak a spy inside of a building that's going to have security, et cetera, et cetera. Much tougher. Not to say it can't be done, not to say that it's not done, right? But it changes the game. So absolutely. So technology comes into it. How does that affect it? Okay. So you've got things like listening devices. That's a very real concern technology wise. You've got drones, right? So, okay, you've got all the security watching practice fields so that other teams can't get in here. But if you put a drone overhead, heck, it's done. And I'll tell you, I interviewed a drone expert, and he told me, frankly, man, you could have a drone 100 yards overhead that can see everything as clear as day. They can see the blades of grass, and teams will have no idea, none whatsoever that is there. He said, as a matter of fact, you could park that puppy up on a rooftop and just, film all day long. And it, as long as that you have battery life for that drone, it can do it. He's like, there's no way, especially when we start calculating for the sun, when you're trying to look into the sun and see a drone, and these drones, you can paint drones so that, the bottom side is all white to match the clouds or whatever you want, or camouflage white and blue. They're not going to see it. It's just not going to happen. So absolutely, and playbooks, playbooks have gone from being on paper to a lot more digital copies nowadays. And so when you're talking about a team being able to penetrate your playbook by hacking in, that's a very real possibility. I mean, that's happened in baseball. All the draft secrets were hacked into by a former coach of a team. So to think that sort of thing is not happening in football is not realistic. Absolutely. Technology and changes in technology, it has evolved the way collection is done. Absolutely. And that will continue to take place. With drones, it used to be teams were worried about helicopters and airplanes, paranoid about them. Coaches would actually stop practices. There was actually one coach who would try to get people to write down the registration numbers of airplanes so they could call the FAA and see, hey, I saw this plane flying overhead. I want to make sure, it doesn't belong to Al Davis or whoever they thought was, spying at the time. And so, it's changes, but I think that's one of the things that makes it really interesting. It's not the same old. It's always evolving. It's always adapting. There's always a better way to do things, and the best minds are going to find the ways to get it done.
Okay. Now, have you found anywhere in your research where there's been some botched attempts where maybe a team figured out that somebody is doing some espionage and they sort of turned suit on them and pulled a fast one on them? And do you have any examples of that if you do?
So many botched attempts. So I'll start by just saying yes. So the first thing to understand is that most teams do not have what I would call a professional collector of information on their team. So what most football teams have is a head of security. And typically that head of security is a former high-ranking police officer, or more likely a former FBI agent. So he's very well rehearsed on defending information, how to interact with law enforcement, do physical security stuff, etc. But is he actually trained to gather information on, to be a spy per se? He may have some training, but typically the answer is no. And even if he did have a little training, typically that's not his real job. So the bottom line is that typically falls on members of the coaching staff to pull off spying. And guess how well coaches are trained to spy, as well as the next random dude on the street, right? Not at all. So they're literally just making up plans and going, okay, well, let's give this a try. And so what that often leads to is some absolutely ridiculous attempts, some very poorly thought out plans, or at least executed plans, because they don't know what they're doing. And so I think that part of it is really interesting. So here's an example of a Bosch attempt. It was 1965, and Raider scout Maury Schleicher. So he is caught on the Jets bus. Okay, Raiders and Jets are just about to play a game, and he gets caught being on the Jets bus returning to the hotel after a pregame practice that was held in Oakland. So obviously, I would assume he managed to watch the practice that was held, and then jumped on the bus and said, you know what, while I'm here, I might as well listen in and try to see if I can find, listen to any tidbits of what these guys are talking about on their way back to the hotel. And he was caught by the Jets head coach, Weeb Eubank, and kicked off the bus. Luckily the, team was kind enough not to pound in his face before they dropped him off. But yeah, that's a botched attempt. It's just an example of a guy saying, hey, I got this great idea. I'm going to try this. And, and sometimes it leads to teams getting in trouble. Sometimes it leads to, some teams are just like, hey, this is just part of the game. It just happens. And frankly, some of the teams that complain about it, they're the same teams that are doing it. Or, they may not be using that technique, but they're using another one. And so, yeah, it's a fun game of cat and mouse.
Yeah, and it's been going on since the inception of football, because I can remember a story that I read, and it goes a little bit something like this. Walter Camp, great coach at Yale, guy that basically put most of the rules of football in, it changed it from rugby. He was coaching Yale, and he was coming up with a pretty brilliant scheme at the time of the sort of a wedge blocking technique that was just killing opponents. And so they were going to be playing Harvard coming up in the next few weeks. So Harvard got wind of this by some espionage, and figured out a way that they were going to counter this. And there was a gentleman there that had standing and watching the Harvard practice. Well, he went back to California, over on the West Coast, was sitting at a bistro somewhere there in one of those cities, I believe it was San Francisco, and he was telling his friend about it. He goes, "Oh yeah, Harvard's going to have Yale's number. They're doing this and this and that." Well, sitting at the next table was a Yale enthusiast and fan. Sent a telegram back to Walter Camp, told him everything that he heard, and Yale came out with another surprise tactic for him, and ended up beating up Harvard pretty good in that game. And they sat there scratching their heads, hey, how did this happen? So it's been happening even before the technology, and it's just interesting how things sort of play out that way.
I've got very interesting examples of both of those things. I mean, the military would say loose lips sink ships, at least the Navy guys do. Right. And that's, I've got a whole section on that in my book. Absolutely. Because Players often talk too much, and elicitation is a huge technique. Just getting a guy talking, and you think you're just talking about, he's just being nice to you, he's shooting the breeze. And then the next thing you know, you don't even realize it, but you're spilling secrets and he's sucking them out of you. And absolutely. And when it comes to, all those changes that come from one game to the next, for the most part, roughly 10 to 20% of a game plan will actually change from game to game on average, right? Teams, especially offenses, they're doing the same stuff week in and week out with a few different wrinkles. It's a matter of picking up those wrinkles. And occasionally you'll get something big like a change in a formation, especially before the first game of a season. That's very common. And that's one of the big times that teams attempt to spy on other teams, especially to spy on their practices, because you're not really sure, teams get a new quarterback to start the season. Oh, heck, what are they going to look like? What are they doing? We don't have any tape of this. So in those critical situations, it's really important. And also times when you have a little extra time, let's say you've got a bye week, you've got 2 weeks before your next opponents, or you've got a little extra time before the Super Bowl or a playoff game. Those are the times that teams are really going, you know what? We got an extra week. What are we doing with it? Hey, we can be doing some film study, but we can be doing a lot of spying in other ways. And absolutely, I think that's what makes why I have so many anecdotes about the Super Bowl. It's because of that extra time that teams have to plan and prepare, and obviously, the importance of the game and teams just going all in and really being willing to push the boundaries to get that final win. It's gonna bring so much glory to them and their team.
Well, very, very interesting. Why don't you let's give the listeners the opportunity to know where they can get the book. Go ahead and say the title of the book again and where they can find it.
Sure. So the book is called Spies on the Sidelines, The High Stakes World of NFL Espionage. And it can be purchased through Amazon. I'm going to have a hardcover book, ebook, and those are both available now for pre-order. The book is released on the 13th of July. So chances are by the time you're listening to this, you probably, it's already available. There will also be an audiobook that's about 6 weeks behind everything else that will be coming out very shortly. But if you want to see, the book's going to be available through most major book retailers. And if you go to my website, which is www.spiesonthesidelines.com, it will have all of your purchase options. You can go through the publisher, Barnes and Noble, Books A Million. Lots of independent stores are carrying it. It's all over. It's selling in a ton of different countries, and it's going to be pretty widely available online.
Okay. Well, Kevin Bryant, I appreciate you coming on here talking about your book. It sounds extremely interesting. And I'll give you opportunity to, maybe if you want to tell one more little tidbit that to entice the readers to make sure they get that to your website and get that pre-ordered. Why don't you go ahead and do that now, please? All
right. Well, if you got a minute, how about I read you a short passage from the book? And absolutely. I think this pretty well sums up what the book talks about. While the phrase three-letter agency is a euphemism for American spook organizations such as the CIA and the NSA, the NFL is a three-letter agency in its own right. Behind the game day action of the NFL is a world much like the cloak and dagger realm of American intelligence agencies. The NFL has its own history, filled with espionage-related stories that sound like something right out of the Cold War. Spies disguised as reporters, military officers, and priests, and even a dwarf playing the role of a baby being pushed in a stroller. Covert surveillance of targets' movements, hiding draft prospects by shuffling them in and out of hotels in aliases, tapped telephones, signals interception, decoy signals, encryption, code breaking, and radio frequency jamming, false flag operations, monitoring air traffic and airline passengers, spies scaling rooftops and telephone poles, and clandestine photography undertaken from high-rise hotels with long-lensed cameras, peepholes, secret listening devices, surveillance photos relayed by zipline, and whispered conversations masked by running water, stolen documents and trash cans sifted for secrets, subversion of individuals mired in debt, and a hilltop secured by Navy SEALs.
Oh, wow. That is tremendous. I like it. I like it. Now, folks, you really got to get this book. You have a guy that's a history major, a major in intelligence and military training and intelligence, and in sports management. All three mixed together. He's writing this book for you, and it's one of those you have to have in your library. So make sure you get that. We will post up on Kevin's website on our show notes of this website or of this podcast, and we'll put it on the website, Pigskin Dispatch, for the accompanying article. So in case you're driving, you don't have time to write this down. Kevin Bryant, thank you very much for sharing your time with us today, sir.
Thank you so much for having me on. Appreciate it.
Peeking up at the clock, the time's running down. We're going to go into victory formation, take a knee, and let this baby run out. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you back tomorrow for the next podcast. We invite you to check out our website, pigskindispatch.com, not only to see the daily football history, but to experience positive football with our many articles on the good people of the game, as well as our own football comic strip, Cleat Marks Comics. Pigskindispatch.com is also on social media outlets, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and don't forget the Pigskin Dispatch YouTube channel to get all of your positive football news and history. Special thanks to the talents of Mike and Jean Monroe, as well as Jason Neff for letting us use their music during our podcast.
This podcast is part of the Sports History Network, your headquarters for the yesteryear of your favorite sport. You can learn more at sportshistorynetwork.com.
It was just another ordinary day in the offices of the Pittsburgh Guardian newspaper circa 1924. But for Marla Delft, assistant editor, everything was about to change. For she was about to discover the awesome attractiveness of Row 1 brand retro sports paraphernalia items thanks to Orville Mulligan, sports writer.
And there it is.
Wow, Orville, that's really the bee's knees.
Isn't it just? A poster-sized replica of the actual 1909 World Series program cover.
I can see that. But where did you get it? And where'd you get it framed?
I ordered it from the Row 1 website, where over 6,000 items of sports memorabilia from the 1880s to the 1990s are available for reproduction in multiple sizes and in several different materials, with over a dozen styles of frame to choose from for prints like this.
Well, I'm sure Mr. Delft would love to put up more of these in the office. But I'm equally as sure they're beyond this newspaper's budget.
Not at all, my dear Marla. See for yourself. Go to sportshistorynetwork.com/row1.
sportshistorynetwork.com/row1. Oh my, these are good prices. Oh, and look at this stuff. Oklahoma-Nebraska football, college basketball art, Michael Jordan items.
And so
retro
it was that
sports
Marla Delft
advertisement
discovered the
flowers.
splendiferous magic of Row 1 sports memorabilia, arts, and prints. You can too by visiting sportshistorynetwork.com/row1. That's ROW1 today for access to the full Row 1 catalog of gallery prints and gifts like t-shirts, long-sleeve shirts, telephone cases, coffee mugs, blankets, pillows, towels, and even shower curtains. Act today for 15% discount off all prints with coupon code SHN15 and 20% off all other items with coupon code SHN20 at checkout. And keep your dial locked to the Sports History Network for the exciting chronicles of the 1920 sports world in Orville Mulligan, sports writer. Coming soon.